So this is the part of the format where we start exploring things. Last week I played White Blue Flash, did pretty well, but if you look at the Magic Online results from this weekend, you see a lot of weird stuff happening. Aetherworks Marvel got first and second in the PTQ. It did okay in the mocks. Deck is sort of starting to make a comeback. People are dropping like ceremonious rejections, and basically the format is starting to shift again, which is good because it keeps things interesting and also lets you just, try and build some decks that weren't necessarily viable 2 weeks ago. So, given where the format is moving now, where it's like back to Marvel, therefore less Delirium, maybe more control, more White Blue Flash, but just like no rebuffs, more negates and stuff like that. This deck is not necessarily well positioned in that format, but it is a deck that I think is worth trying just because it has done pretty well recently. It's been a little bit under the radar, and it's like back to my roots. Like, this is the deck that I built week 1 of Standard and just kind of worked on it a decent amount, and this is kind of where it is now. So, Black-Red Aggro. I'm going to talk about the mana base first because I started with Aether Hub instead of Smoldering Marsh, basically because Smoldering Marsh is not good for your turn 1 plays, your Bomat Couriers and your Inventor's Apprentices, and obviously Aether Hub is not great with Inventor's Apprentice anyway, but you'd kind of be surprised. You can play Inventor's Apprentice off a Hub and then play a Scrounger or a Copter on turn 2, and then it doesn't really matter past that, but you do need black for Scrap Heap, Scrounger, Unlicensed Disintegration, and those are the only black cards in my list initially. And that's why I felt like Hub was a better dual land than Smoldering Marsh, just because you could play it and it would always be untapped. Unlike the Smoldering Marshes, which are going to need to be tapped on at least turns 1 and 3. And it's also pretty bad if you're like light on lands. So like you have a 2-lander with a Smoldering Marsh. It's like, well, you want to kind of get your 1-drop out there on turn 1, but you also want to play a 2-drop on 2. And if you have a Marsh in your hand, it's kind of going to screw you over. So the reason the Marshes are back in is because we have Bloodhall Priest, we have more black cards in general. There are some black cards in the sideboard, but there's no Kalitas or anything, so it is possible that we could have a mix of Marshes and Hubs. For now, I'm just going to try what other people are doing, which is playing 4 Marshes. So yeah, we have Scrounger, Unlicensed Disintegration, Bloodhall Priest. Otherwise, the rest of this is just a red deck. We have Inventor's Apprentice and Bomat Courier to start on turn 1. Let's see if I can actually explain this. This is a tough concept. So there are things like Falconwrath Gorger, Insolent Neonate. There are other playable red 1-drops. So why these red 1-drops and why only 8? Like, if this is a red beatdown deck, why not play just like a bunch of 1-drops? Like, isn't the triple 1-drop draw the dream? Well, yes and no. Things like Bomat Courier and Insolent Neonate are not so good to the point where you want to draw multiples of them, and if you flood the board with them, it is like you have a lot of diminishing returns past the first copy. Like, 1 Bomat Courier is great because it gives you a way to refuel. It's an artifact, which matters for things like Inventor's Apprentice, occasionally Pia Noir. It's kind of a madness outlet when you want to actually just like cash in your hand or what's left of your hand for, whatever cards that you pulled off the top of your deck. But yeah, you don't necessarily want a draw with 3 Bomat Couriers, and going triple 1-drop Bomat Courier is not going to really kill anyone. It's basically just like the one that is there to provide like kind of this nice little threat, but also a way to refuel later, and you don't necessarily want a ton of that effect. Insolent Neonate is fine with the madness stuff. Basically, I've decided that it is a worse key to the city, and the weird thing about this deck is that wherever you put a resource matters. And by that, I mean, you're going to have things like Key to the City, Lightning Axe, Bomat Courier to some degree. Like, the cards that you discard matter, and the fact that, like, if you curve out into triple 1-drop and you have things like Key to the City and Lightning Axe that are very demanding from cards in hand, then the worse off you're going to be. Like, you're going to have less options, you're going to feel more constrained, so I don't know if that actually makes sense or not. It makes sense to me. I understand what's happening, but it's tough to explain because there hasn't really been a format or a deck like this where, like, sure, Blue-Green Madness, and there were some Red-Green Madness decks that were not very good, but Blue-Green Madness was, like, kind of like that, but not really. And now that I think about it, this deck is, like, very similar as far as, like, not necessarily like cards it plays in strategy and stuff, but as far as like the amount of cards on the curve, like you have your Basking Root Wallas and your Careful Studies, you have your Wild Mongrels and your Aquamoebas, you have your Arrogant Worms, like it is all pretty similar. Fiery Temper is basically like the best circular logic in Standard. Counter their spell for 1 mana, but yeah, it's weird. Like this is not a hyper aggressive red deck. This is not a go wide red deck. This is kind of like a mid-rangey sort of red deck where you do have some burn spells, you have some reach, you have capability of burning people out. You have Fiery Temper, Unlicensed Disintegration, and Bloodhall Priest, which are all pretty nice. But most of this deck is trying to do is just like control the board, get an advantage, kind of like snowball things, and then you have a lot of play in the mid to late game with Scrap Heap, Scrounger, Key to the City, Pia, Bloodhall Priest, Copter, Bowmaker, basically every card in your deck that's not Inventor's Apprentice, you know? So it is, I don't know, kind of important to look at this and realize that while there are a lot of, red producing lands and red mana symbols on your cards, you don't necessarily want to build a burn-based red deck every single time and have it just be like this suicidally aggressive thing that, like, if they're not dead by turn 6, they're winning. So yeah, this deck has a lot of play to it. I feel like this is more similar to something like Black-Red Vampires during the Cawblade era than it is to, I don't know, a Tarka Red, something like that. But yeah, a lot of weird things going on with this deck, basically, and hopefully the matches kind of put those things on display. So, yeah, we got some creatures, got some threats that are pretty good in the mid to late. We have Fiery Temper, Lightning Axe, and Unlicensed Disintegration as removal. I really like the Bloodhall Priest just because it kind of allows you to fight in the mid to late game, whereas other versions of this deck were more focused on getting their opponent dead. They played things like Fleet Wheel Cruiser, and the format's in a place now where like you kind of have to grind, and Bloodhall Priest lets you do this, and Bloodhall Priest is a very important stabilizer against something like White-Red Vehicles, where you get to play kind of this removal game that caps out at Bloodhall Priest, and I have some Sky Sovereigns in the sideboard to kind of do the same thing. So Bloodhall Priest might not be like the most impressive card in general, but I think it is very good in this deck and how this deck is now structured and what this deck needs to do in the current format to actually compete. Unlicensed Disintegration and Lightning Axe, both very important in that they are instant speed and they kill Avacyn. So with White-Blue Flash being so big, it is a very prominent part of the metagame. You do need answers to those cards. Again, the old version of this deck played Incendiary Flow. It was fine against like Sylvan Advocate and Prized Amalgam, just like cards that I thought people would play at the time, and now those cards don't see much play. So you can still use Incendiary Flow to kill a Spell Queller, but you are likely better off just having something like Lightning Axe because it can kill Spell Queller instant speed when they tap out for something. Then you don't have to worry about Rattle Change, which granted is a card that not many people are playing anymore, but you don't have to worry about like another Spell Queller, stuff like that. Also tags Avacyn. When you add Bloodhall Priest into the mix, Lightning Axe starts looking pretty good because you can discard Temper, you can discard Priest, you can discard Scrap Heap Scrounger. So, not a ton of drawback on Lightning Axe, but occasionally it does matter. I kind of wanted to only play 2 axes, but I didn't know what the other card to play was. So, I could see something where you cut an axe and a Pia and play like a 2 of. Some people were playing like Forerunner of Slaughter, some people had Heir of Falcon Wrath. Those cards are all fine, not super exciting. I do like, I mean, it's important to have enough artifacts for Inventor's Apprentice, and I do like Pia Noir for that, but I also like Pia Scrap Heap Scrounger to just be like this mid-game push where you just get to like falter a bunch of stuff, which is pretty sweet. But yeah, that's about it for the main deck. As for the sideboard, not set in stone by any means. I wrote down a list of cards that I wanted to play. Collective Brutality, or not wanted to play, but could have played. Collective Brutality, Descendant Mindbender, Chandra, Harness Lightning, To the Slaughter, Savage Alliance, Lost Legacy, Nahiri's Wrath, Kalidas, Tears of Valakut. A lot of options for the sideboard. I went with Transgress just as, I don't know, kind of like the de facto anti-combo piece. Like, this is good against Aetherworks Marvel. Like, you definitely want to beat them down, but you kind of need to disrupt them a little bit while you're doing it because your deck's not fast enough to necessarily just race them, especially when they have green Puzzle Knot. So, Transgress helps there a lot. If I was going back to hub, I also considered having Harness Lightning to help with the hubs. Harness Lightning is a card that you could probably replace, a Lightning Axe with. Like maybe you want to play Harness Lightning instead of an Axe and a Pia, and then you have a little bit more removal, a little more energy to turn your hubs on. And then you could play like Deadlock Trap in the sideboard, which would be like another answer to big things. But I think I kind of just like that as an answer to the Marvel decks, just because they're marveling into big stuff. And granted, the Marvel decks that did well in these PTQs and stuff were like Ishkana. A lot of them were red-green. So maybe Deadlock Trap is not the best answer. You could also play To the Slaughter, but they always, not always, but they sometimes have things running around like Servant of the Conduit and whatever. So plan against white-red vehicles, since they're a little fatter than you and a little faster than you. So you either want to go under them or slow the game down and kind of just like lock up the board. So I have Galvanic Bombardment, Weaver of Lightning, Sky Sovereign. That might be too many cards. The extra Weaver could certainly be something else, but overall this seems like a pretty good plan against them, and then I'm probably just cutting some of my smaller stuff, maybe like Scrap Heap Scrounger because it doesn't block, but I really don't think that you can go full control and attempt to control someone's board in the standard, and then like that's your only game plan. I feel like Scrap Heap Scrounger actually helps a lot in that game plan, where it's something that puts them on a clock while you're also keeping them under control, and then that'll let you turn the corner a lot faster. But yeah, maybe the low impact stuff like Bomat Courier might have to go, for example. And then I have 4 Key to the City in my 75. Maybe that's a bit much. I don't know, but I think it's the best card against Black Green Delirium. It is one of the best cards with Bloodhall Priest. And yeah, that's about it. My sideboard is very narrow, very confined. I generally don't like that, but I don't know. When you're just trying stuff out, I think it's okay to identify the things that you definitely think you'll need, and then from there you can kind of make like hedges where it's like, okay, so right now I have 9 cards for mirrors and white-red vehicles, decks that are similar to those, and maybe going forward I only need 7 of those cards. So okay, like what am I going to do with those slots? Where could I use a little bit of extra help and stuff, and then you kind of open up from there. And right now it's looking like I probably need help against Marvel, but I don't really want to play like Pick the Brain or something. Like I don't know if there's another discard spell that's worth playing, or if I should be trying to stop like their Emrakul or Ulamog after it comes into play. Like maybe they get to decimate my board a little bit, but as long as I remove their big threat, I'll have a lot of time. But generally that's not the case, because they can usually, like once they start marveling, they can usually just marvel almost every turn. So that's generally not a good plan. I would rather just stop them from having marvel, period. It's possible that they could marvel into Emrakul. You could kill Emrakul and then kill their Marvel, but that's asking way too much, I think. And the artifact removal in red is surprisingly not good. Like, if Shatter were around, I would almost certainly play at least like 1 or 2 copies of Shatter. But, yeah, that's it. Let's battle.